Chapter 1. The town that lives for Christmas. Brian Coswell had always believed there were two kinds of people in the world. Those who tolerated Christmas and those who lived for it. His hometown didn't just live for it. It built a shrine, threw a parade, and invited everyone to worship at the altar of twinkling lights and peppermint cocoa. The town of Christmas, population just under 5,000, had a reputation that stretched far beyond the Midwest. Every December, starting on the first day of the month, the streets transformed into something out of a snow globe. Electric street lamps went dark, replaced by vintage gas lamps that flickered like tiny stars. Cars were banished to the outskirts, and horses reclaimed the cobblestone streets. Vendors lined the square, hawking roasted chestnuts and cinnamon rolls the size of dinner plates. The air smelled like sugar and nostalgia. Brian guided the reins of his carriage with practiced ease, the leather creaking softly under his gloved hands. Two chestnut horses trotted ahead, their breath puffing in white clouds against the crisp air. The stagecoach behind him gleamed with red velvet seats and tasteful garlands. A Bluetooth speaker tucked discreetly in the corner playing Bing Crosby's voice like a gentle hum. His daughter, Shiela, perched beside him on the driver's bench, her legs swinging in rhythm with the horse's gait. "Daddy," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had recently mastered the art of spelling her own name. "I'm 6.5. Brian smiled, tugging the brim of his wool cap lower against the wind. "You've told me that about, 100 times today. Because people keep forgetting," she said, exasperated. 6.5 is different than 6. It means I'm almost 7. That's practically grown up. Practically, Brian agreed, though he suspected her definition of grown up still involved tiaras and glitter glue. "You planning to pay taxes next year?" Shiela gave him a look, the kind his mother used to give when he tracked mud through the kitchen. Hands on hips, chin tilted, eyes narrowed. The stare. Brian had started to suspect there was a secret society of women who passed down that look like an heirloom. His daughter had clearly been inducted early. "Taxes are boring," she declared. "Princesses don't do boring things." Brian chuckled, flicking the reins gently as the horses slowed near the pickup point. A small crowd waited by the wooden platform, bundled in scarves and coats, cheeks pink from the cold. The stagecoach was a hit during the festival. People loved the idea of stepping back in time, even if the Bluetooth speaker betrayed the illusion. "Ready for more passengers?" he asked. Shiela straightened her posture like royalty. "Ready." Brian hopped down first, boots crunching on the frosted ground. He moved toward the group with an easy smile, offering a hand to an elderly couple who climbed aboard with the enthusiasm of teenagers. A family with 2 toddlers followed, the kids squealing at the velvet seats. Brian's life had become a rhythm of these small interactions, polite greetings, steady hands, and the occasional compliment on the horses. It was simple, predictable, safe. And then he saw her. She stood slightly apart from the others, adjusting the strap of a leather satchel on her shoulder. Her coat was a deep forest green, cinched at the waist, and her dark hair spilled from beneath a knitted hat in loose waves. She wasn't smiling like the rest, just watching, as if cataloging the scene for later. When her gaze met his, Brian felt something shift, like the quiet crackle before a fire catches. "Need a hand?" he asked, stepping closer. Her eyes flicked to his outstretched hand, then back to his face. For a beat, she hesitated, long enough for him to wonder if he'd misread the moment. Then she placed her gloved fingers in his, and he helped her up the step. Her grip was firm, warm even through the wool. "Thank you," she said, her voice low, smooth. No city girl rush, no clipped syllables. Just calm. Brian nodded, releasing her hand before it lingered too long. "Enjoy the ride," he offered, retreating to the driver's bench before his thoughts could spiral into something foolish. Shiela leaned toward him as he climbed up. "She's pretty," she whispered, not even trying for subtlety. Brian cleared his throat, focusing on the reins. "Eyes forward, co-pilot." "I'm just saying," Shiela sang, swinging her legs. "She looks like a princess." Brian didn't answer. He wasn't sure what to say. He'd spent years building a life that didn't leave room for surprises, especially the kind wearing forest green coats and looking at him like she saw more than a guy who fixed carburetors for a living. The carriage jolted into motion, wheels crunching over snow-dusted cobblestones. Behind him, laughter bubbled from the passengers as the horses picked up their pace. Shiela launched into a monologue about how the carriage was her royal chariot, complete with imaginary dragons and heroic quests. Brian let her words wash over him, a familiar soundtrack to his days. But his mind kept circling back to the woman in green, sitting somewhere behind him, watching the world through frosted glass. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. And he sure as hell didn't know why his chest felt tight, like something dormant had stirred awake. Maybe it was nothing. A fleeting moment, gone as quickly as snowflakes on warm skin. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the start of something he hadn't dared hope for in a long time. Chapter 2. A hand offered. Sandra had never been good at slowing down. Even now, sitting in a velvet-lined carriage that smelled faintly of pine and cinnamon, her mind kept trying to sprint ahead, back to the life she'd left behind, to the emails piling up in an inbox she hadn't checked in 2 weeks, to the question that haunted her every time she closed her eyes. What if I'm the problem? She tugged her gloves tighter, watching the snowflakes swirl past the frosted window. Outside, the town square glowed like something out of a postcard. Gas lamps flickering, garlands draped across shop fronts, laughter spilling from bundled-up families. It was beautiful, almost painfully so. The kind of beauty that made you wonder what you'd been chasing all those years when you thought success was measured in promotions and corner offices. Her aunt's voice broke through her thoughts. Isn't this lovely? The older woman's cheeks were pink from the cold, her eyes bright with the kind of joy Sandra hadn't felt in, well, longer than she cared to admit. Sandra smiled faintly. It is, she said, and meant it. For once, she wasn't lying to make someone else comfortable. The carriage jolted gently as it rolled forward, and Sandra's gaze drifted to the man on the driver's bench. Brian, his aunt had called him when they'd climbed aboard. He sat tall, shoulders broad beneath a wool coat, his gloved hands steady on the reins. There was something about him, something quiet, grounded, the kind of presence that didn't demand attention but held it anyway. She thought of the way he'd offered his hand when she stepped up. Simple, polite, no expectation, no lingering glance that made her want to shrink into herself. Just kindness. When was the last time a man had done that without turning it into a transaction? Her chest tightened unexpectedly. She looked away, focusing on the horses instead. Two chestnuts, their coats gleaming under the lantern light, breath puffing in soft clouds. The rhythm of their hooves was soothing, like a heartbeat she could borrow for a while. Daddy says these are the fastest horses in town. A small voice piped up. Sandra turned, startled, then smiled at the little girl perched beside Brian. She couldn't have been more than 6, though judging by the proud tilt of her chin, she might argue otherwise. I'm 6.5, the girl announced before Sandra could ask. That's almost 7. Sandra laughed, the sound bubbling up before she could stop it. Well, that's very grown up. The girl nodded solemnly. I'm the co-pilot. Daddy drives, but I tell him where to go. Sounds like an important job, Sandra said, warmth spreading through her chest. There was something about the child's confidence, unfiltered, unapologetic, that made her ache a little. When had she lost that kind of certainty? Brian glanced back briefly, his eyes meeting hers for a fraction of a second. It was nothing, really, a polite acknowledgement, a flicker of connection, but Sandra felt it like a spark against dry tinder. She looked away quickly, pretending to adjust her scarf. The carriage rolled on, weaving through streets that looked dipped in magic. Vendors called out cheerfully, offering cocoa and candied apples. Children darted past, their laughter ringing like bells. Sandra let herself breathe it in, the cold air, the scent of pine, the hum of Bing Crosby from the hidden speaker. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt something loosen inside her. Not gone, not fixed, but lighter. Her aunt leaned closer. You're smiling, she whispered, as if it were a secret worth keeping. Sandra didn't answer. She wasn't sure she could explain it. How do you put into words the way a stranger's simple courtesy can feel like a lifeline? How do you admit that you're 31 years old and still wondering if love is real, or if it's just another story people tell themselves to make the chaos bearable? The carriage slowed near the square, lanterns casting golden halos on the snow. Brian hopped down first, moving with easy confidence. He opened the door, offering his hand again. Sandra hesitated only a moment before taking it, her fingers curling around his. Warmth seeped through the wool, and for a heartbeat, the world narrowed to that single point of contact. Careful, he said softly, steadying her as she stepped onto the platform. Thanks, she murmured, her voice catching on something she couldn't name. Then the moment was gone. He turned to help her aunt, and Sandra forced herself to move forward, boots crunching on snow. The square stretched before her like a dream, lights, music, laughter. But all she could think about was the man in the wool coat and the way his hand had felt in hers. Chapter 3. The small-town gossip network. The diner smelled like Christmas had exploded in a sugar factory. Peppermint steam curled from mugs, cinnamon clung to the air, and Bing Crosby crooned softly from the jukebox in the corner. Brian sat at the counter nursing a coffee that had gone lukewarm 20 minutes ago, staring at the swirl of whipped cream in Sheila's hot cocoa like it held answers to life's bigger questions. Spoiler, it didn't. Sheila was perched on the stool beside him, swinging her legs and humming jingle bells, with the kind of enthusiasm that made strangers smile and Brian wonder if caffeine came pre-installed in children. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her hair escaping the neat braid his mother had done that morning. She looked happy, radiant, even, and that was enough to make Brian's chest loosen a little. Brian Coswell. A voice sang out behind him, dripping with mischief. You've been holding out on us. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. Marlene, queen of roller skates and unsolicited commentary, glided up with a tray balanced on one hand like a circus act. Her blonde curls bounced as she leaned over the counter, eyes sparkling with gossip. Excuse me, Brian said, though he already regretted asking. Marlene grinned. Word on Main Street is you had a lady in your carriage today. Brian groaned inwardly. Of course, in a town this size, secrets traveled faster than Wi-Fi. She was a passenger, he said evenly. Like everyone else. Hum. Marlene slid a plate of gingerbread cookies toward Shiela, who accepted them like tribute. Funny. Because Edith saw you help her down like she was royalty. Said you even smiled. Brian pinched the bridge of his nose. I smile at everyone. Not like that, Marlene sing-songed, skating away before he could argue. Shiela crunched into a cookie, crumbs dotting her chin. She was pretty, she said around a mouthful. Like a princess. Brian stared at his coffee. You're supposed to be on my side. I am, Shiela said cheerfully. Princesses are good. You should marry one. Brian choked on his coffee. What? Shiela shrugged, utterly unfazed. You don't have a girlfriend. Grandma says you're picky. Brian made a mental note to have a word with his mother about boundaries. Grandma talks too much. She says you need someone who makes you laugh, Shiela continued, swinging her legs like a metronome. And someone who likes horses. And cookies. Brian sighed, watching Marlene skate past again, humming something suspiciously like, Here Comes the Bride. He wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the town's matchmaking instincts or the fact that a stranger in a green coat had managed to wedge herself into his thoughts like a stubborn splinter. He didn't even know her name. And yet, as he watched snow drift past the diner window, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted today. Something small, quiet, but undeniable. Chapter 4. Sandra's second ride. Brian had just finished brushing down the horses when he saw her. It was late afternoon, the kind of winter light that painted everything in shades of gold and rose. Snowflakes drifted lazily from a sky the color of pewter, settling on the garlands strung across Main Street. The square was alive with music and laughter, vendors calling out, children darting between stalls, the scent of roasted chestnuts curling through the air. And there she was, forest green coat, knitted hat pulled low, dark hair spilling in waves. Sandra. He didn't know her name yet, but his chest tightened all the same. She was walking beside an older woman, her aunt, if Brian remembered right, carrying a paper bag that looked suspiciously like cookies. Her gaze swept the square, lingering on the stagecoach parked near the platform. When her eyes met his, something flickered, recognition maybe, or curiosity. Brian told himself to play it cool. Just another passenger. Nothing more. Daddy, Shiela whispered, tugging his sleeve. Princess is back. Brian cleared his throat. Co-pilot, eyes forward. But Shiela was already grinning like she'd solved the mystery of the universe. You should ask her name. Brian ignored that, stepping forward as the group approached. Afternoon, he said, voice steady. Ready for a ride? Sandra smiled, small but real. If you've got room. Always, Brian said, offering his hand before he could overthink it. Her fingers slid into his, warm through the wool. For a moment, the world narrowed to that single point of contact. Then she was stepping up, graceful despite the boots, and Brian was left wondering why something so simple felt like a spark in his veins. Inside the carriage, laughter bubbled as passengers settled in. Brian climbed to the driver's bench, Shiela bouncing beside him like a spring wound too tight. You didn't ask her name, Shiela hissed. Not now, Brian muttered, flicking the reins. The horses surged forward, hooves crunching over snow. Behind him, Sandra's voice drifted through the open window, soft and melodic as she spoke to her aunt. He caught fragments, something about taking a break, needing space, finding quiet. Words that sounded like escape, like someone trying to breathe again after years underwater. The carriage rolled past the square, lanterns glowing like tiny suns. Shiela launched into her usual monologue about dragons and royal quests, earning chuckles from the passengers. Brian let her chatter fill the silence, but his mind kept circling back to the woman in green. The way her laugh had sounded yesterday, light, surprised, like she'd forgotten she could. As they neared the drop-off point, Brian hopped down first, boots crunching on frost. He opened the door, offering his hand again. Sandra took it without hesitation this time, her grip firm, her eyes meeting his. Thank you, she said, voice warm. Brian nodded, words sticking in his throat. He wanted to ask her name. He wanted to ask 100 things. But the moment slipped away as her aunt called out, and Sandra turned toward the square, her coat flaring like a forest in motion. Brian watched her go, heart thudding like hooves on cobblestone. Daddy, Shiela said, tugging his sleeve. You're staring. Brian exhaled, forcing a smile. Eyes forward, co-pilot. But even as he climbed back onto the bench, he knew the truth. He wasn't just staring. He was hoping. Chapter 5. The invitation. Brian had learned 2 things about small-town life. Nothing stayed secret for long, and if you gave people even a whiff of romance, they'd turn it into a full-blown Christmas special before you could blink. He was reminded of this truth 3 days after the carriage ride with Sandra, when his mother called him at the garage. The ringtone alone was ominous. Deck the halls, blaring like a warning siren. Brian, she said without preamble. Edith told me Sandra's aunt is hosting a Christmas Eve party. Brian wiped his hands on a rag, eyeing the engine he'd been working on. And, his mother continued, voice brimming with triumph. You and Shiela are invited. Brian blinked. We are. Yes, Edith said Sandra mentioned you'd probably come. Isn't that lovely? Brian stared at the phone like it had personally betrayed him. Mom, Don't you dare say no, she cut in. You've been hiding in that garage for years. It's time you put on a nice shirt and remembered you're 32, not 80. Brian opened his mouth, closed it, and sighed. I don't even know what to say to her. Start with hello, his mother said sweetly. Then maybe ask her to dance. Dance? Brian nearly dropped the wrench. Mom, it's a Christmas party, not a wedding. Details, she said breezily. Wear the blue sweater. It brings out your eyes. Before he could argue, she hung up, leaving Brian staring at the silent phone like it had detonated in his hand. That evening, Shiela was sprawled on the living room rug, coloring a picture of a horse wearing a tiara. Brian sat on the couch, still trying to process the ambush. Kiddo, he began carefully, how do you feel about going to a Christmas Eve party? Sheila's head popped up, eyes wide. Will there be cookies? Probably. Hot cocoa? Almost definitely. Then yes, she grinned, flashing a gap where her front tooth had been. Can I wear my princess dress? Brian hesitated. It's not that kind of party. Shiela tilted her head, considering. Then I'll wear my sparkly sweater. The one Grandma says makes me look like a snowflake. Brian chuckled, ruffling her hair. Deal. As she went back to coloring, Brian leaned against the couch cushion, staring at the twinkling lights on their modest tree. He'd spent years building a life that was safe, predictable. And now, with one invitation, it felt like someone had cracked the door open to something he wasn't sure he was ready for. But when he pictured Sandra's smile, the way it had softened the edges of her face, the way it had made something in his chest shift, Brian knew one thing for certain. He wanted to see her again. Chapter 6. The Christmas Eve Party. Brian had never been a fan of parties. Too many people, too much noise, too many chances for someone to ask questions he didn't want to answer. But tonight, as he stood on the porch of Edith's Victorian house with Sheila's mittened hand in his, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Nervous. The house glowed like a beacon against the snowy night, every window spilling warm light onto the frosted lawn. Wreaths hung on the doors, candles flickered in the windows, and the faint sound of carols drifted through the air. Brian tugged at the collar of his blue sweater, the one his mother had insisted on, and glanced down at Shiela. She was practically vibrating with excitement, her sparkly snowflake sweater catching every glimmer of light. Daddy? She whispered, eyes wide. This looks like a castle. Brian smiled faintly. Then I guess you're the princess. Shiela grinned, showing off the gap in her teeth. And you're the knight. Before Brian could respond, the door swung open and Edith appeared, cheeks rosy, apron dusted with flour. Brian. Shiela. Come in. Come in. She ushered them inside with the kind of enthusiasm that made Brian wonder if she'd been waiting by the door. The warmth hit him first, then the smell. Cinnamon, nutmeg, something rich and buttery. The living room was a riot of color. Garlands draped across the mantel, stockings hung in neat rows, a tree glittering in the corner like it had swallowed a box of ornaments whole. People milled about with mugs of cocoa, laughter bubbling like champagne. And then he saw her. Sandra stood near the tree, talking to a woman Brian vaguely recognized from the diner. Her green dress was simple but elegant, cinched at the waist, the color deep enough to make her dark hair gleam. She laughed at something, and the sound curled through the room like smoke, soft, warm, impossible to ignore. Brian's pulse kicked up. He told himself to breathe, to act normal, to not look like a man who'd spent 3 days wondering if he'd see her again. Daddy? Shiela whispered, tugging his hand. There's the princess. Brian swallowed hard. Yeah, he said softly. I see her. The evening unfolded in a blur of holiday cheer. Shiela disappeared into a pack of kids decorating gingerbread houses, leaving Brian to navigate conversations about snowplow schedules and the diner's new peppermint pie. He smiled, nodded, laughed in the right places, but his attention kept drifting back to Sandra. Finally, as the crowd thinned near the tree, Brian found himself standing beside her. She turned, and for a moment, the noise faded. Hi, he said, voice rougher than he intended. Her lips curved. Hi. They talked about the snowstorm forecast, about how the town looked like a movie set, about Sheila's insistence that the carriage was a royal chariot. Sandra's laugh came easily, and Brian found himself wanting to hear it again, and again, like a favorite song. Then Edith swooped in with a tray of cookies, and Brian stepped back, nearly colliding with the doorway. He muttered an apology, and Sandra smiled warm, amused, like she saw right through him. Later, as the party wound down and carols drifted from the piano, Brian found himself near the archway leading to the hall. A sprig of mistletoe hung above it, tied with a red ribbon. He noticed it a second before Sandra did. Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to that small space between them. Brian felt the pull soft, insistent, like gravity had shifted. He saw the question in her eyes, felt it mirrored in his own. And then, Daddy! Shiela barreled into him, clutching a gingerbread house that looked like it had survived a minor earthquake. Look what I made. Brian laughed, the tension snapping like a brittle ornament. That's beautiful, kiddo. Sandra smiled, her gaze lingering for a moment longer before she turned away, her dress swaying like a whisper. Brian watched her go, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. Almost, he thought. Almost. Chapter 7. Sparks and snowstorms. The snow started as a whisper, soft flakes drifting lazily past the diner windows while Brian finished his last cup of coffee. By the time he stepped outside, it had turned into a steady curtain, blanketing Main Street in white. The gas lamps glowed like halos in the swirling storm, and the air smelled sharp and clean, like winter had decided to show off. Brian pulled his coat tighter, scanning the square. Most of the vendors were packing up, their laughter muffled by scarves. The festival would wind down early tonight. Even Christmas magic had limits when the weather turned fierce. He was halfway to the carriage when he saw her. Sandra stood near the lamppost, her green coat dusted with snow, her hat pulled low against the wind. She looked stranded. Her aunt was nowhere in sight, and the crowd had thinned to a handful of determined revelers. For a moment, Brian hesitated. Then Sheila's voice piped up from the carriage. "Daddy, look, it's the princess." Brian sighed, smiling despite himself. "Stay put, co-pilot," he said, striding toward Sandra. She turned as he approached, relief flickering across her face. "Hi," she said, voice soft against the wind. "I think my ride left without me." Brian glanced at the empty street. "Looks that way." Sandra laughed lightly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Guess I should have left earlier." Brian hesitated only a second before speaking. "I can take you home. The carriage is warm, well warmer than standing here." Her brows lifted. "You do that?" Brian shrugged. "It's either that or let you freeze. And I'm pretty sure the town would revoke my Christmas license if I did." Sandra smiled then, really smiled, and something in Brian's chest shifted like a gear catching. "Thank you," she said. Minutes later, they were settled inside the stagecoach, the velvet seats glowing under soft lantern light. The Bluetooth speaker hummed with Bing Crosby, and the horses snorted impatiently as Brian climbed onto the driver's bench. Shiela sat beside him, bundled in her sparkly sweater, humming Silent Night under her breath. The snow fell heavier now, muffling the world in white. The wheels crunched softly as the carriage rolled forward, lanterns casting golden halos on the drifts. Behind him, Brian could hear Sandra's voice, low, warm, as she spoke to Shiela through the open window. "So, you're the co-pilot?" Sandra teased. "Yep," Shiela said proudly. "Daddy drives, but I tell him where to go." Sandra laughed, and the sound curled through the cold like smoke. Brian felt it settle somewhere deep, like a melody he didn't know he'd been missing. Halfway down the road, the storm thickened, forcing Brian to slow the horses. The world was a blur of white and gold, the kind of night that felt like a secret. He glanced back once, catching Sandra's gaze through the window. Her cheeks were pink, her eyes bright, and for a moment, the noise in his head, the doubts, the questions, went quiet. When they reached her aunt's house, Sandra stepped down carefully, her boots sinking into fresh snow. Brian offered his hand without thinking, and she took it, her fingers warm even through the gloves. For a heartbeat, they didn't move, just stood there, snow swirling around them, lantern light painting everything in gold. "Thank you," she said softly. Brian nodded, words sticking in his throat. He wanted to say something, anything, but Sheila's voice broke the spell. "Bye, princess," she called, waving from the carriage. Sandra laughed, her breath fogging in the cold. "Bye, co-pilot." Then she turned, her green coat disappearing into the glow of the porch light. Brian watched her go, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. Hope, maybe, or the dangerous beginning of it. Chapter 8. Brian's doubts. The garage was quiet except for the hum of the space heater and the occasional creak of the old rafters. Outside, snow fell in lazy spirals, blanketing the world in white. Brian sat on the edge of his workbench, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like it held answers he couldn't find. The night before had been something. He kept replaying it in his head. The way Sandra had laughed during the carriage ride, the way her voice softened when she talked about leaving the city, the way the lantern light had caught in her hair like threads of gold. And then, when the horses slowed near her aunt's house, the way she'd lingered for a moment before stepping down, her eyes meeting his like she wanted to say something but couldn't. Brian had wanted to say something too. Something simple, something honest. Stay. Or maybe just don't disappear. But the words had stuck in his throat, heavy with all the reasons he shouldn't speak them. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the grit of exhaustion. He'd built his life around one truth. Shiela came first. Always. Every decision, every sacrifice, every long night in this garage had been for her. And now, for the first time in years, he was thinking about what he wanted. That scared him more than he cared to admit, because wanting meant risk, and risk meant chaos, the kind that had blown through his life once before and left him picking up pieces with a baby on his hip. He could still hear his mother's voice from last night, after he dropped Shiela off at her house, so he could salt the icy roads. "You deserve to be happy, Brian," she'd said, her tone gentle but firm. You've done nothing but give for 6 years. It's okay to want something for yourself. He'd laughed it off, but the words stuck like burrs. Did he deserve it? Could he even trust it? Dating today felt like a game with rules he didn't understand. People didn't stay. They got bored, restless. They left. He'd seen it happen, hell, he'd lived it. Brian stared at the snow drifting past the garage window, his chest tight. He wanted to believe Sandra was different, that the warmth in her eyes wasn't temporary. But wanting didn't make it true. Daddy. The small voice pulled him from his thoughts. Shiela stood in the doorway, bundled in her puffy coat, her cheeks pink from the cold. She held a paper snowflake in one mittened hand, the edges uneven but charming. Grandma said you were hiding, she announced, marching in like a tiny general. Are you sad? Brian forced a smile. No, kiddo. Just thinking. About the princess? She asked, tilting her head with innocent precision. Brian blinked. What? Shiela shrugged. You look like you're thinking about something nice. Or someone nice. Brian chuckled, the sound rough in his throat. You're too smart for your own good. She grinned, climbing onto the stool beside him. Grandma says I get it from you. Brian looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something shift. Maybe his mother was right. Maybe wanting wasn't selfish. Maybe it was human. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Sheila's forehead. How would you feel, he asked slowly, if Daddy had a friend? A nice one. Sheila's eyes lit up like the Christmas tree at Town Square. Like a princess friend? Brian laughed, the tension in his chest easing just a little. Maybe. Then I'd feel happy, she said simply. Because you smile more when you talk about her. Brian swallowed hard, his throat tight. Leave it to a 6.5-year-old to cut through the noise. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But as he pulled Shiela into a hug, feeling her small arms wrap around his neck, Brian knew one thing for certain. He wanted to try. Chapter 9. Sandra's choice? Sandra stared at her phone like it was a ticking bomb. The email subject line glared back at her in bold letters. Exciting opportunity? Let's talk. She didn't need to open it to know what it meant. The company she'd walked away from, the one that had chewed her up and spit her out, wanted her back. Not just back, but promoted. A bigger title, a bigger salary, a bigger slice of the life that had nearly broken her. She set the phone down on the kitchen counter and pressed her palms against the cool surface, breathing slowly. Outside, snow fell in soft sheets, blanketing the world in white silence. Inside, her thoughts roared like a storm. This was what she'd wanted once. The corner office, the respect, the proof that she was enough. But now, standing in her aunt's cozy kitchen with the scent of cinnamon lingering in the air, Sandra wasn't sure anymore. The idea of returning to that life made her stomach knot. The endless meetings, the late nights, the hollow victories. She'd left because she was drowning, and now they were offering her a bigger pool. Her aunt bustled in, humming a carol, and paused when she saw Sandra's face. Bad news. Sandra shook her head, forcing a smile. Just news. Her aunt eyed her for a moment, then poured 2 mugs of cocoa and slid one across the counter. You've been happier here, she said gently. I can see it. Sandra wrapped her hands around the warm mug, letting the heat seep into her fingers. Happier. Was that true? She thought of the carriage rides, the laughter that had come so easily, the way Brian's voice sounded when he said her name. She thought of Sheila's bright eyes and the way the little girl had declared herself co-pilot, like it was the most important job in the world. She had been happier, lighter, like she could breathe again. But happiness wasn't practical. Happiness didn't pay bills or secure futures. Happiness didn't erase the fear that maybe she wasn't enough without the title, the salary, the proof. Her phone buzzed again, and Sandra flinched. She didn't pick it up. Instead, she stared out the window at the snow-draped street, where lanterns glowed like tiny stars and laughter drifted from somewhere down the block. This town felt like a storybook, and she was terrified it was temporary. Because what if Brian wasn't what she thought? What if this warmth, this spark, was just holiday magic that would vanish with the decorations? She'd seen men leave before. She'd seen promises crumble. She wasn't sure she could survive that again. Her aunt's voice broke through her thoughts. You don't have to decide tonight. Sandra nodded, but the weight in her chest didn't lift. She wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe she had time. But the truth was, every choice carried a clock, and hers was ticking louder by the minute. She closed her eyes, gripping the mug like an anchor, and whispered to herself, so softly the words barely existed. What do I really want? Chapter 10. The kiss. Snow fell like confetti from a sky the color of pewter, soft and relentless, blanketing the town square in a hush that felt almost sacred. Lanterns glowed along the cobblestone streets, their flames flickering against wreaths dusted with frost. Music drifted from the bandstand, a slow, lilting carol that wrapped around the square like a warm scarf. Brian stood near the fountain, his breath curling in the cold air, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. He'd driven the last carriage run an hour ago, stabled the horses, and told himself he was just stopping by the square for Sheila's sake. She was currently darting between vendor stalls with his mother, cheeks flushed, clutching a gingerbread cookie the size of her head. But Brian knew the truth. He was here because of her. Sandra. She appeared like the snow. Quiet, unassuming, and somehow impossible to ignore. Her green coat stood out against the white, her dark hair tumbling from beneath a knitted hat. She was laughing at something her aunt said, the sound carrying across the square like a bell. When her gaze lifted and found his, the laughter softened into something else, something that made Brian's pulse stumble. She walked toward him slowly, boots crunching on snow, her breath visible in the lantern light. Brian felt rooted to the spot, like moving would break whatever fragile thread had pulled her to him. "Hi," she said when she reached him, her voice low, warm despite the cold. "Hi," he echoed, because his brain had apparently decided to take the night off. For a moment, they just stood there, the world narrowing to the space between them. Around them, the square buzzed with life, children squealing near the carousel, vendors calling out cheerfully. But it all felt distant, muffled, like someone had turned down the volume on everything except her. "You're hard to find," Sandra said, a smile tugging at her lips. "I thought you'd be driving until midnight." "Last run ended early," Brian said. "Horses needed a break." "And you?" she asked softly. "Do you?" Brian swallowed, his breath catching on the weight of the question. He wanted to tell her everything, that he was tired of being the guy who stayed because someone else couldn't, that he'd built a life so steady it sometimes felt like a cage, that he wasn't sure if love was real anymore. But all that came out was, yeah, sometimes. Sandra's eyes softened, and for a heartbeat, Brian thought she might reach for his hand. Instead, she glanced toward the fountain, where a sprig of mistletoe dangled from an iron hook, swaying gently in the breeze. "Looks like tradition," she murmured, her voice teasing but her gaze steady. Brian followed her eyes, then looked back at her. His heart thudded like hooves on cobblestone. He could walk away, make a joke, keep things safe. Or he could take the risk that had been whispering to him since the day she stepped into his carriage. He stepped closer. Sandra didn't move, didn't flinch. Her breath mingled with his, warm against the cold. Brian lifted a hand, brushing a stray curl from her cheek, his fingers trembling just enough to betray him. Then, slowly, carefully, he kissed her. It wasn't fireworks. It wasn't chaos. It was quiet and certain, like the first light after a long night. Her lips were soft, her gloved hands curling against his coat as if anchoring herself. For a moment, the world held still. The snow, the music, the laughter. And Brian felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. When they pulled apart, Sandra's eyes were bright, her smile small but real. "Guess that's one way to celebrate Christmas," she whispered. Brian managed a smile, his chest tight with something that felt suspiciously like joy. "Best tradition I've ever followed." Behind them, a voice rang out like a trumpet. "Daddy kissed the princess." Shiela barreled toward them, cookie crumbs trailing like confetti, her grin wide enough to split the night in two. Brian groaned, Sandra laughed, and the square erupted in cheers because, of course, half the town had seen. But for once, Brian didn't care. Let them talk. Let them spin their stories. Because for the first time in a long time, Brian Coswell wasn't thinking about what he'd lost. He was thinking about what he'd just found. Chapter 11. Aftermath. The square was still buzzing when Brian finally managed to steer Sandra away from the fountain and the mistletoe. Not that it mattered, half the town had already seen, and the other half would hear about it before sunrise. In Christmas, gossip traveled faster than sleigh bells. They walked side by side through the snow, their boots crunching softly, lantern light painting golden halos on the cobblestones. Brian's heart hadn't quite settled. It thudded like a drum in his chest, loud enough he was sure Sandra could hear it. He kept his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, partly for warmth, partly because he wasn't sure what to do with them now that they'd held her. Sandra broke the silence first. "So, that happened." Brian glanced at her, catching the curve of her smile. "Yeah," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "It did." She laughed softly, the sound curling through the cold like smoke. "I don't usually kiss men in public squares." "Me neither," Brian said. "Guess we're both breaking traditions." Her smile faltered just a little, and Brian saw it, the flicker of uncertainty behind her eyes. He wanted to ask what she was thinking, wanted to tell her he wasn't the kind of guy who played games. But before he could, a small whirlwind in pink mittens barreled toward them. "Daddy!" Shiela skidded to a stop, cheeks flushed, eyes sparkling with mischief. "You kissed the princess. Does that mean you're getting married?" Brian groaned. "Shiela. Because if you are," she continued solemnly, "I need to approve her first. I'm the boss of this relationship." Sandra laughed so hard she had to cover her mouth, and Brian felt heat creep up his neck. "We're not," he started, then gave up. There was no winning against a 6-and-a-half-year-old armed with royal authority. Shiela planted her hands on her hips, the stare in full force. "Just saying. No surprises." Brian muttered something about bedtime and gently steered his daughter toward his mother, who was waiting near the cocoa stand with a look that said, "We'll talk later." When he turned back, Sandra was watching him, her expression softer now, almost tender. "She's amazing," Sandra said quietly. "She's my whole world," Brian replied, and the truth of it settled between them like fresh snow, quiet, undeniable. For a moment, they just stood there, the square humming around them, and Brian felt something shift again. Not the spark from earlier, not the rush of the kiss. This was deeper, steadier, like the ground beneath his feet had changed. But then Sandra's phone buzzed in her pocket, and the spell broke. She pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and Brian saw her smile fade. "Work?" he asked, though he already knew. Sandra nodded slowly. "They want me back. Big promotion. Big everything." Brian's chest tightened. He didn't know what to say, didn't know if he had the right to say anything. So he just stood there, watching her tuck the phone away like it weighed 100 pounds. "I need to think," she said softly, almost to herself. Brian nodded, his throat thick. "Take all the time you need." But as she walked away, her green coat disappearing into the swirl of snow and lantern light, Brian couldn't help wondering if time was the one thing he didn't have. Chapter 12. New Year's Eve. The town square shimmered like a jewel under the winter sky. Strings of lights crisscrossed above the cobblestones, glowing against the snow that had fallen overnight. Music floated from the bandstand, upbeat now, a lively rhythm that made even the cold feel festive. People milled about in coats and scarves, laughter curling through the frosty air as the countdown clock ticked toward midnight. Brian stood near the edge of the crowd, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, watching Shiela dart between stalls like a sparkler on legs. She wore a paper crown someone had given her, declaring herself Princess of Christmas. And Brian didn't doubt for a second she believed it. He should have felt lighter tonight. The square was alive, the air electric with celebration, and yet his chest felt heavy. Sandra hadn't called. Not since that night under the mistletoe. He told himself not to expect anything. She had a life waiting for her, a big promotion, a future that didn't involve horse-drawn carriages and small-town gossip. But hope was a stubborn thing. It clung like frost on glass, refusing to melt. "Daddy!" Shiela barreled toward him, cheeks flushed, crown askew. "Grandma says they're doing fireworks at midnight. Can we stay?" Brian smiled faintly. "Of course." She grinned, then leaned closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Maybe the princess will come back." Brian's throat tightened. "Maybe," he said softly, because what else could he say? And then, like the universe had a sense of timing, he saw her. Sandra stood at the far end of the square, her green coat vivid against the snow, her dark hair tumbling from beneath a knitted hat. She looked different, lighter somehow, like someone who'd set down a weight she'd been carrying too long. When her gaze found his, the noise of the crowd faded, and Brian felt the world tilt. She walked toward him slowly, boots crunching on snow, her breath visible in the lantern glow. Brian's pulse stumbled, his hands curling into fists inside his pockets to keep from reaching for her too soon. "Hi," she said when she reached him, her voice warm despite the cold. "Hi," he echoed, because his brain had apparently decided to stick with tradition. For a moment, they just stood there, the countdown clock ticking behind them, the crowd buzzing like static. Then Sandra took a breath, her eyes steady on his. "I turned down the promotion," she said simply. Brian blinked. "You what?" "I don't want that life anymore," she said, her voice firm but soft. "I thought I did. For years, I thought success meant being exhausted and alone. But then I came here, and I realized something." She smiled faintly. "I want a life that feels like this. Warm, real, messy maybe, but mine." Brian stared at her, words tangling in his throat. "Are you sure?" he managed finally. Sandra nodded. "I'm sure." The countdown began. 10, 9, 8, and the crowd roared, voices rising like a tide. Brian didn't hear them. He stepped closer, his breath mingling with hers, his heart pounding like hooves on cobblestone. "Happy New Year," he whispered when the clock hit 1, and then he kissed her. Fireworks exploded overhead, painting the sky in bursts of gold and crimson. The crowd cheered, music swelled, and Shiela squealed somewhere behind them, declaring herself Queen of Love at the top of her lungs. Brian laughed against Sandra's lips, and for the first time in years, he felt something he'd almost forgotten. Joy, pure and simple. When they pulled apart, Sandra's eyes were bright, her smile small but certain. "So," she said softly, "what now?" Brian grinned, his chest light for the first time in a long time. "Now," he said, "we see where this goes." And for once, that felt like enough. Chapter 13. Epilogue. 1 year later. Snow fell in lazy spirals outside the church windows, frosting the panes like delicate lace. Inside, the air hummed with quiet anticipation. Soft music, murmured voices, the faint scent of pine from garlands draped along the pews. The town of Christmas had outdone itself, as always. Lanterns lined the walkway, wreaths hung from every door, and the square outside shimmered like a jewel under the winter sky. Brian stood near the altar, adjusting his tie for the third time. He wasn't nervous, at least that's what he told himself, but his hands had a mind of their own. He glanced toward the front row, where Shiela sat proudly in a white dress sprinkled with sequins, a crown of holly perched on her head like a badge of honor. She caught his eye and grinned, giving him 2 enthusiastic thumbs up. "You look like a prince, Daddy," she stage whispered, loud enough for half the church to hear. Brian chuckled, shaking his head. "Thanks, boss," he murmured, earning a giggle from her and a knowing smile from his mother beside her. The music shifted, and Brian's breath caught as the doors opened. Sandra stepped inside, and for a moment, the world narrowed to her. Her dress was simple, ivory satin that skimmed her frame, a hint of lace at the sleeves. But on her, it looked like something spun from moonlight. Her dark hair tumbled in soft waves, a sprig of holly tucked behind one ear. She carried a bouquet of winter roses, pale and perfect, and when her eyes met his, Brian felt the same quiet certainty he'd felt under the mistletoe a year ago. She walked toward him slowly, each step measured, her smile small but steady. Brian's chest tightened, not with fear, but with gratitude. For the second chance he hadn't dared hope for the life they were about to build, for the little girl in the front row who had declared herself queen of love, and, in a way, made this day possible. When Sandra reached him, Brian took her hand, warm and sure in his. The minister began to speak, words about love and commitment and seasons of change, but Brian barely heard them. All he could think was how far they'd come, from a carriage ride in the snow to this moment, standing before family and friends, ready to promise forever. "Do you, Brian Coswell, take Sandra?" "I do," Brian said, his voice firm, his heart steady. "And do you, Sandra?" "I do," she whispered, her eyes bright. The kiss that followed wasn't fireworks or chaos. It was quiet, certain, and full of promise, like the first light after a long night. The congregation cheered. Shiela squealed, and somewhere in the back, Marlene dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, muttering something about finally. Outside, the bells rang, and the town square erupted in celebration. Lanterns glowed, music soared, and snowflakes danced like confetti. Brian and Sandra stepped into the cold hand in hand, Shiela skipping between them, her crown tilted but her grin unstoppable. "Best wedding ever," she declared. "Now can we have cake?" Brian laughed, pulling Sandra close as the crowd surged around them. "Cake first," he said, "then forever." And as the three of them walked into the glow of lantern light, Brian realized something he'd almost forgotten. Sometimes love doesn't arrive in a whirlwind. Sometimes it comes quietly, wrapped in velvet and snow, waiting for you to take the reins.